people to do charitable works. And what we discover is there's no single motivation, and that probably most people had a collection of motivations. And these are just some examples, right? No one person probably had all of them. It would just kind of depend on that individual. So one thing to note is that all the Abrahamic religions have an extremely strong strain of ethics in them. So the Abrahamic religions, right, are Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. They all share the prophet Abraham. They all share this very ethical focus. And that's to say today, just because we don't have much time, I'm just going to limit myself to Christians, medieval Christians. But of course there were medieval Muslims and medieval Jews, and they practiced charity too. And some of their practices are quite similar actually to Christians, in that there's a kind of broad motivation to practice charity because of this old Jewish idea that one must treat others in an ethical manner. This is crucial to being a good person, right? And how that manifests can vary, but that's very important. Another thing is that we have quite a few medieval writers across the centuries. Most of them, I must admit, are from the later Middle Ages, but certainly in the early Middle Ages we get some of this as well. And that is that people emphasize that charity can't be something that is just like emotion. It has to have thought and purpose behind it. So the examples that some of these thinkers would use is they would say, if you just give some money to the poor, but you don't really think about it, or you don't really contemplate it, or have some kind of sentiment behind it, it isn't really charity, because that's not having that brotherly love, that form of compassion that's so important. And many writers said it's the compassion that's more important. And this was one way in which we see that charity is not something just for the religious and not just for the rich. I think that's also sometimes an idea that people have. There were very poor people in the Middle Ages, and we have records of them sacrificing a great deal to give something to, say, an institution, or to give to people who they perceived to be poor than, or to the sick. And they would sacrifice very much to do this because this was considered to be an act of compassion as much as it is like that you have some extra money to give away, right? And so this idea is very, very old, right? It comes all the way from the beginnings of Christianity and late antiquity, so very important. The other thing is that in medieval Christianity, there's definitely an emphasis on the suffering of Jesus, and this might be something that's familiar, but there's a lot of rituals that developed and traditions that developed about focusing on Christ's suffering, especially on the cross. And the idea is that Christ did that for people to give them salvation, and that the best way to remember this is to identify with that suffering and maybe have yourself suffer some too. Now this kind of manifests itself in a variety of practices, but if you think about charity, it's that idea of give till it hurts, right? That's part of it, but also to think about Jesus helping the poor, right? To focus on imitating Christ, right? To walk in his footsteps, a very common phrase in the Middle Ages. And then there's also this great focus, and this is really mainly for like 11th century on, is Mary's compassion. So the cult of Mary became very popular from the 11th century on. So this is, Jesus' mom. And the idea was that she's very compassionate. And many medieval people felt more comfortable praying to her than to many other saints, or to even directly to Christ or to God. And the idea was that Mary would be very sympathetic because she'd been essentially like a layperson, right? She'd been a mom, and she'd been a mom who lost her son, and so she knew what suffering was, and for that reason she was going to feel a lot of compassion for people. And so a lot of medieval people focused their religious attentions on her. And the idea is that you can best fulfill the ideals that Mary set out for you by being compassionate to other human beings, right? To perform acts of charity. And of course, I won't quote a bunch of scripture and verse to you, but it is a big concept in Christian scripture. Those of you familiar with Christian scriptures will know that there are many places in the Christian scriptures where there's an emphasis on taking care of others, right? Particularly people like widows, orphans, the poor. This is going to come back to haunt us, right? Very important. The other thing is that for a lot of people, charity was a form of penance that didn't involve rejecting the world. So we have to flash back to the very, very early church. There was an idea that if you did something wrong, a sin, you had to in some way do penance or atone for it. And it took a long time for Christians to develop exactly how to do this. But one idea was that you could do good works to make up for the bad things you did. So charity becomes a form of penance. Now, obviously, there are a lot of other forms of penance, but one of the first forms of penance, one of the first forms that you could take to make up for doing something bad, was to become like a monk or nun. But if you do that, you give up the world, right? You have to give up everything, including your own self-autonomy, because monks and nuns had to take vows of obedience, and then poverty, you give up everything. I mean, that's kind of extreme, right? If you think about it, this is not for most people. And so many people did not do that, but charity is something they can do that doesn't involve that complete rejection of the world. And the other thing that some historians have suggested, and a very famous historian who suggested this in particular is a guy named Lester Little, so if you're curious. And he noticed this. He said, actually, a lot of the big charitable groups that rise up, they rise up in cities. Now, in part, this is the nature of the historical evidence, right? We usually, as historians, we get more from cities than we do from the countryside, just because that's where people live. So in part, you could say, well, maybe this is because we have more information from the cities. But really, you do see this charity really cropping up very much in cities. It could also be because Roman cities, and especially the officials who oversaw Roman cities, they were responsible for charity. They gave out charity to the poor. And so this would naturally live on in cities, especially because a lot of medieval cities were old Roman cities. But all that said, starting in around the 11th, 12th century, you really see a steep increase in charitable organizations, including most of the ones I'm going to talk about here in a second. And this historian Lester Little said, this is because people feel guilty or anxious. And the reason they're feeling so guilty and anxious is, in the early Middle Ages, people were relatively poor on average. There were not big cities, there's still trade. You don't want to think everything just completely falling apart. Like, that's an old idea of what happens in the early Middle Ages that has been disproven. But things really slow down, right? This is not a prosperous period in many respects compared to later. But what starts to happen around the 10th century, 11th century is cities start to grow, trade takes off, the population increases. Suddenly there's all this new wealth in growing cities. And Lester Little said maybe people felt really nervous about this because, you know, it does say in Christian scripture that it's harder for a rich man to go to heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle, right? And medieval Christians knew this scripture and they thought, oh my gosh, if I have all this money, what's going to happen to me? And Lester Little kind of points out that there's this terrible anxiety that you can almost measure in some cities, especially in Italy. And so that this anxiety over prosperity causes people to try to find ways to kind of make up for the fact that they're rich. So they're worried about that. Now the thing is, as I'm an early medievalist myself, I focus on the 9th century. And what's interesting is in the 9th century, we actually have cases where aristocrats are worried that they're going to go to hell in part because they're rich, right? So this is not like a totally brand new idea, but it's increasing at this time. The other thing is that by the 12th century, there is a clear concept of purgatory, right? This place that's not quite heaven and it's definitely not quite hell, it's totally in between. You go to purgatory because you've done something bad, not bad enough to get you damned to hell forever, but something bad enough that you can't just go straight to heaven. And the idea is that prayers can help someone get out of purgatory, but they also developed the idea that charitable acts may help someone get out of purgatory. So if you're worried about your dead relatives, which many people were, because people in the Middle Ages actually felt they had a really strong relationship to their dead relatives and that this was important, definitely don't think this is ancestor worship, because occasionally I have students who kind of associate it with that, but it's completely different. It's just the idea that you have kind of responsibility for your dead relatives. And if they're in purgatory, it is your obligation to either pray for them, give money to make sure someone else is praying for them, particularly monks and priests who were thought to have very efficacious prayer, or you do charitable acts in their name to kind of help boost them out of purgatory, right? And so that was something that was very important too. And finally, one other motivation is that providing charity actually gave lots of people a chance to provide spiritual and secular leadership. And this does sound probably like it's getting back to this old 18th century idea that carries on, especially to the 19th century, that religion is something powerful people like the elites can use to dupe the poor or something like that. But that's not entirely what I mean here. And I'm going to give you a case in a little bit of where a group of people who were not necessarily poor, but they weren't super rich either, they gather together and provide charity as a way of having great and important leadership in their city, both secular leadership and spiritual leadership, and that charity can be sort of a vehicle for that. So I promise this is the last slide with lots of print on it. We'll have some nice pictures. So The one other thing I wanted to mention as kind of a motivation, something that like we don't concentrate much on in our modern world, at least in my opinion, and that is that, especially by the later Middle Ages, people had this kind of constant reminder of death that we lack, actually. If you think about our culture, death is something that is very much kept away from us, and that we've built a culture that keeps death kind of separated from the living in many ways. Whereas in the Middle Ages, the living and the dead were always kind of in proximity. And in fact, much medieval art and literature kind of emphasizes memento mori, right? Always remembering you're going to die. And this is an example of this, kind of a famous one. It's in Croatia in the 15th century, so we're looking at Eastern Europe here too. And what you see is this is the dance of death, right? And this was a common sort of depiction in the especially by the later Middle Ages. And it's meant to remind people, you're going to die. And you need to remember that. And I think sometimes we think, oh, they just did that to scare people. Okay, yes, obviously they did, right? But it's also a way to bring about good spiritual practices. I mean, so that if you want to think about it in a different light, a kind of more positive light, many medieval people would have thought that this was actually like an aid to their spirituality, that this helped them by reminding them of what was to come and to remind them of what's actually important, right? If you know you're going to die, suddenly the world around you is going to look different, right? And your priorities might be different. And so this is something else that people have suggested helps motivate medieval charity, is this realization that, well, you know, when you're dead, as you can see here, it doesn't matter what your occupation was here. And here, you know, you've got a merchant, and you have a lady, and you have a king. You can see with the scepter and his crown. It doesn't matter, right, who you are. You're all going to die. It's all going to be the same for you. So is it really important to have that wealth and hoard it all up on earth? No, you should give it away. So that's important too. So the one thing I want to let you know is medieval charity can sound an awful lot like modern charity, right? But there are some important differences to keep in mind that can make medieval charity seem a little bit different. So this is why I'm going to say, like, not our usual charitable activities. I'm going to point out some things that are a little different about medieval charity. One is that there is, in some ways, a tension in the Middle Ages between what we could call institutional charity and personal charity. The old idea used to be is that charity started as an institutional thing because the Romans practiced this. This is like bread and circuses, right? You give bread to poor people to keep them from causing problems, right? And so Roman officials were constantly giving out food, ensuring that the urban poor had something to eat. And that it was charity, right? And eventually what happens is church officials take this over. Bishops essentially are the heirs to Roman officials. Bishops take over almost all their activities. So bishops in late antiquity are giving out charity. And then there was this idea that medievalists had that it starts to transform over time and become more personal, especially from the 12th century on. Now medievalists are complicating this, and what we're saying is it's probably more the case that the institutional and the personal is always happening at the same time. It's just sometimes there's more acts of personal charity that's motivated from an individual's desire to do it, and sometimes there's more of an emphasis that things are done through institutions. So we see both, right? And this is something that is kind of crucial kind of distinction in the Middle Ages to kind of keep in mind. So then the other thing is that it's important to know, and I'm borrowing something here from a kind of prominent scholar of charity named Marco van Leeuwen, and he said that you can think of charity as a form of social interaction between rich and poor. It's a way that they have a relationship with each other. And this is actually really, really important because medieval Christians would have said, if you don't actively engage with the person you're giving charity to, it's not really charity. And that's quite different from modern charity, right? Where a lot of times, don't we all, like I do this, you write a check and you think, oh, you know, I did something nice, right? But it didn't mean that I went and helped those people I wrote a check for.